I've lived in New York basically my whole adult life. So when I do a production in New York, which is unusual for me, I've done shows mostly out of town, one of the things that's really most interesting to me is to see how does this production fit in basically with what else is going on in town, and that this production, every production that happens, is part of a larger community, and it's one obviously the people pay a lot of attention to. So from every show, Broadway, off-Broadway, off-Broadway, I feel like things that are happening at the same time. I'm always so curious as to if you looked at them all at once, what would they say to people? And so I've noticed that there are other shows going on in town that seem to make me feel that this show as well has a part to play in the bigger message that it's putting out. So I can give you some examples. A couple of shows, Angels in America is in right now, and you might not find a sort of a parallel there, but I kind of think, okay, so they're happening at the same time. What's in the air? What's kind of feeding both of these shows? And that one, clearly has a sort of a, not to be too dramatic about it, but it does. I mean, that sort of has an apocalyptic thing that sort of puts it all away. Not just the plague of AIDS that the show looks at, but what Tony Kushner writes about is it's a sort of a more foreboding thing, and the millennium is coming, and that things are about to crack wide open, and that new rules are changing, and it's a brand new area. And I feel like my character, the character of Walter, it's sort of a similar thing, that this is a tremendous upheaval in his life, and he's forced to go to some places and to rely on himself in the same way. So I feel that's sort of a kind of a kindred spirit in there. But it may also, I find it also in maybe some less obvious places, and I can give you an example about that. So it was interesting, for example, that My Fair Lady is in town right now, and I would think, well, what would they also have there? I would sort of say, in some ways, Walter is a little bit like Eliza. He's sort of in a place where he's like, India, take me in. I'm in this strange place where all the customs are unfamiliar to me, and I don't know where to turn and where to rely. And it's this real journey that he takes and has to transform himself in sort of the same way that she does. On a more superficial level, you can look at the fact there's some interesting parallels actually with Henry Higgins, which I thought about, in that they are both guys that are committed to taking notes. They take notes all the time. The very beginning of My Fair Lady, Henry Higgins is there. He meets Eliza because he's taking notes. And for Walter, it's sort of an important thing. He's recording. He's sort of trying to make sense of this new world by taking notes and recording, so they both do that. In my scenes, most of the time I spend in the show, I spend talking with a younger woman. I spend talking with Prima, and we have disagreements, and she's struggling with my influence on her about accepting it, yet also finding a way to find her own voice, which is sort of a similar story there as well. And something else which is just sort of almost maybe a trivial parallel, but what's often overlooked about the story of My Fair Lady, and it's also in Pygmalion too, of course, which is based on, is that where is Higgins going? What is he doing before this event changes his life and puts him in a new direction? Well, he's on his way to India. That's where he's going, and this changes his whole story when Eliza comes into his life, and he's there to go to India to make recordings of spoken Sanskrit and what he's interested in, and he's made these things up. So there is a relationship between the West and the East, which this show is part of as well, that I find very, very compelling. That obviously Walter and Henry Higgins are nothing alike, but there's a continuum, isn't there? There's a sort of a journey that they both take in their relationship with these other worlds that they go into. With Walter, I guess I find a sort of a very personal relationship to him. I'm Jewish, and Walter is Jewish, and Walter's relationship with his background, it's not stated so much because this is much more of a journey forwards, but it is obviously instigated by something through which his personal identity can't be denied. I wouldn't say that he was denying it or not, but generally I would say for him he seemed to be in a pretty assimilated place within European culture. So there is a journey, I think, of a personal discovery. I did play, moving on from the idea of sort of what's in the air in theater in New York. What I came from before this production was a new play, and it addressed Kurt Godel, who was a very famous logic professor. He was known as the greatest logician since Aristotle. And I played him in William Hugel's play called Godel, and it was about him. It was a story about his life, particularly about his time spent with Einstein. He ended up spending most of his life in Princeton, New Jersey, at the Institute of Advanced Study, where Einstein spent the end of his career and spent the end of his life as well. That happened to be my hometown, actually. That's where I was brought up. And what's an interesting coincidence is that Walter Kaufmann came from basically the same world in the same time as Kurt Godel. They were both born in Czechoslovakia, what would have been now the Czech Republic. I think Walter was born in, Brno. I don't know if he was born in Brno or he was born in Prague. I can't remember. Anyway, Kurt Godel, he was born just a year before Walter. And it's a crazy coincidence in some ways that we do have details about how Walter was familiar with Einstein. Einstein wrote a letter on his behalf to assist him in getting a position with an orchestra or a teaching position. That letter is extant. It was written in Princeton, in Fine Hall, which is where the Institute was based in its very early days. And this is in the late 30s, when he knew Kurt Godel as well, when Einstein knew him. So these two guys, Walter Kaufmann and Kurt Godel, who probably never met, but I'm almost certain were aware of each other's existence. And if they never met, they certainly were both on Einstein's mind at the same time, in other words, the late 30s, and probably for the same reason, which was to get them both out of Europe. At the time, Walter was in Germany, Kurt Godel was in Vienna, and curiously enough, they both ended up in America. They both ended up as professors in America. Their timeline was different, but they both did the wrong way round. So that the familiar stories, obviously people taking a boat across the Atlantic, like in Casablanca or something like that. Both Walter Kaufmann and Kurt Godel went east. And Kurt Godel eventually crossed the Pacific, and he took a train across America, and that's how he ended up there. But these two guys who were born in the Czech Republic, who both were part of this early 20th century Viennese, Austro-Hungarian Empire, which would have been, they both grew up in, and a German world of culture and intellect, and both were emigres in flight from the Nazis, and both aided by Einstein at basically the same time. They made an eastward journey on their way, eventually ending up in America. So it's that's just a pure coincidence, but that's something that I don't take for granted. So it's a world that I know a good deal about and that has a personal connection for me. So I've been enjoying kind of digging into it from a different point of view. Kurt Godel was very, very different from Walter Kaufmann. Walter Kaufmann was a bit of a humanist. He really had a feel for humanity in a very, very open way. So he talks about when he first encounters Indian music, how the music to him seemed very alienating and incomprehensible, but he made this imaginative leap. He's surrounded by millions of people and suggests that this is music that came from a culture of millions of people, and so he wanted to immerse himself in that culture to get a better sense of this musical tradition. Kurt Godel was very much the opposite. He was very, he lived in his head. He was very much of a straight intellectual. He lived for mathematics. He was just a brain. He was a walking around brain. So he didn't have much of a sense of that same human connection. But they both were great achievers in their way, and they both missed a lot of their culture. There were stories about Kurt Godel. He spent most of his life again in New Jersey, and he kind of missed the sophistication and the urbane life of Europe. But he could never go back because that world was gone. It persecuted him, and he had to leave. So it was a point of kind of reconstituting a new life. For Walter, he sort of reconstituted a life within music and this culture that he adopted and that was kind enough to take him in, and he repaid them, I guess, by composing this very popular line for the All India Radio. And Kurt Godel sort of reconstituted this Austro-Hungarian life basically in his head, just strictly that way. So I've enjoyed sort of seeing both sides of this world, this pre- and post-World War II Europe, how it fed these two lives. And they probably did know who one another was. They certainly had friends in common.